Mrs. Nichols, I know that during the 1800s it was unheard of and unlikely for a woman to divorce her husband. What were the factors that you considered when divorcing your husband?
Well, yes, it was very unusual at that time. However, Mr. Carpenter's family was very loyal to me and continues to be loyal to me. So I repay that loyalty with discretion, and I really don't speak about that time of my life.
So you're not able to talk about the impact it had on your lifestyle or your relationship with your children?
My children and I have a wonderful relationship, so it did not affect the relationship I have with my children.
Well, let's talk some more about some of the reform movements you were involved in. You embraced many of them: temperance, dress reform, anti-slavery, women's rights, as a speaker at the Wyandotte Convention. How did you decide which one of these to address before you spoke?
Well, I addressed what I thought was the most important one, the one of women's suffrage. Because if the women have the right to vote and go to the polls, then some of those other issues can be resolved through the vote, and laws can be changed if the women have the right to go to the polls and vote.
That makes sense. Now, there's a story about you hiding a freedom seeker in an empty cistern in South Carolina. Is that true?
I did hide a freedom seeker in a cistern on my property in Kansas, however. Her name was Caroline. That may have caused the confusion. But Caroline, I hid Caroline in the cistern overnight because that seemed to be the safest place, because there were always slave catchers out and about looking for runaway slaves. I hid her in the cistern and I kept watch over her all night long. I crept out every so often and I spoke to her, tried to encourage her, tried to be cheerful if I could. I brought her some hot, fresh coffee, and I sat and talked to her for a little while to try to ease her fears a bit. I had all of my laundry tubs and such around the cistern to give the idea that perhaps the laundry is what was going on there. The following day, she was able to get into a wagon where we hid her and another slave, and they moved on north toward Canada.
Oh my goodness, were you nervous? Were you scared when you had her with you?
I was somewhat fearful, but the real fear of any mother is the fear of a mother's children. My most intense fear was when my son was shot, because he rode with John Brown's men in the Blackjack battle, and the federal troops were going to arrest John Brown at the time. However, my son was injured, and I carried the bullet that he was removed from near his heart as a remembrance, to remember how important this movement, all of these movements, are.
Well, it's wonderful that she was able to escape to freedom.
Yes.
Mrs. Nichols, can you tell me, how did you use the opportunity of marrying George Washington Nichols, who was the editor of the Windham County Democrat, to advance women's rights?
Well, I had been writing about women's rights prior to even having met Mr. Nichols. So we started a friendship just through writing back and forth to each other. I wrote articles for his newspaper, and then when we married, I actually was the editor of the newspaper, even though his name was on the masthead as the editor.
So I assume that he supported your views on women's rights and abolishing slavery?
Absolutely. He was a very forward-thinking, very progressive gentleman, and he loved frank women who spoke their mind. He was the father of 6 daughters, 3 of whom were in journalism. So he was quite used to women and women's opinions.
So it sounds like you must have had very interesting dinner conversations of an evening.
Very lively conversations.
Would you tell us a little bit about your experiences during the time you lived in a free state settlement? What was your role there?
Well, my role was to try to encourage women to be able to get women's rights for the women in the territory. And of course, it was a very difficult place to live. the conditions were very bitterly cold in the winter and extremely hot in the summer. Terrible storms would roll through. There was a lack of food, a lack of clothing, and shelter, of course, was not very available, and you certainly had to build your own shelter. So it was a very difficult lifestyle. Myself and some other women had tried to get the women's vote here in Kansas, in the Kansas Territory, because the territory had not become a state yet. There was no constitution at that point, and they were just beginning to develop their laws. So there was a better chance for ladies to be recognized in a territory than perhaps back in Vermont or one of the other eastern states.
That was very clever thinking.
Well, thank you.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful life filled with achievements. Would you share with us, what do you feel is your greatest achievement?
I believe the greatest achievement was when we achieved the right for a woman to be able to sue for her own property in the territory, in the Kansas Territory, in her own name, so that she would have property rights. And I believe that along with the fact that women were allowed to vote with regard to education of the children, they had the right to vote. And I think those two things are probably two of the most important things that we've accomplished, that I've accomplished along with the other ladies who were at my side.